I never thought I'd find myself standing in a sweaty workshop, clutching a pair of glowing molten glass like it was a ticking bomb. But there I was, on a whim, having signed up for a glassblowing class because honestly, I needed something, anything, to shake up my routine. My life had been stuck on repeat. Work, eat, sleep, scroll through social media, repeat. So when I saw that local art studio advertising beginner glassblowing lessons, the part of me that often lives in daydream mode said, why not? I wanted to see if I could handle heat in a way that wasn't just complaining about summer or fiery texts from my ex. The place was smaller than I imagined, just a narrow brick storefront tucked between a half-empty bookstore and a ramen joint. Inside, it smelled like a mix of burnt sugar and wet clay, with windows steamed up from the heat of the furnace. It was early evening, and the sun was dipping low enough that the orange glow from the kiln lit the entire room like some weird, cozy campfire. I was nervous, not gonna lie. The instructor, James, caught my eye the second I walked in. He was the kind of guy you'd notice, even if you weren't looking for someone. Tall, with dark hair that curled just enough to look effortless, but not messy. And these deep green eyes that seemed to flicker when the light hit them right, like the fire itself was reflecting in them. He didn't say much at first, just this calm, easy confidence as he showed us the ropes, how to gather the glass, how to turn the blowpipe, and how to avoid burning your fingers off. When it was my turn, my hands shook more than I expected. The molten glass was dangerously hot, like holding a small sun on the end of a metal rod. I struggled, wobbling the glass ball until James stepped beside me, his voice low and steady. You've got a good grip. It's all about trusting yourself to handle the heat. There was something about the way he said that, like it wasn't just glass-blowing advice, but maybe something more. I caught him watching me, not just teaching, but watching, like he liked the way I managed the tension, the focus, the fear. Later, when the class broke for a water break, he leaned in, a half smile playing on his lips, and said, I like watching you handle the heat. I laughed, a little awkward, trying to play it cool, but inside I felt this weird jolt, a mixture of surprise and something I wasn't quite ready to name. Was he flirting? Was I reading too much into it? Either way, it was the first time in a long while someone had made me feel like maybe I wasn't just fumbling through life alone, sweat and all. That night, as I left the studio, the heat from the furnace still buzzed under my skin, and I realized I was already looking forward to next week's class, not just for the glassblowing, but for James. And maybe, just maybe, for whatever heated thing was starting to glow between us. I wasn't sure if I should be excited or terrified about looking forward to seeing him again. I mean, I'm not exactly the kind of guy who's used to this kind of attention, or any attention, really. But there was something about the way James made the whole glass-blowing thing feel less like a disaster waiting to happen, and more like a challenge I could actually meet. Plus, when he said that line, I like watching you handle the heat, it stuck with me. Not just because of the obvious pun, but because it felt like he saw something in me. Or maybe wanted to see something. The next week, I showed up early. The place was quieter than last time, just me and James setting up. He greeted me with that same easy smile, but this time, it had a little spark, like he was genuinely glad I was there. Back for more torture? He joked, handing me a pair of safety glasses. Only if you're the one inflicting it. I shot back, trying to sound casual, but feeling my heart pick up speed. He laughed, and it echoed off the brick walls in a way that made me realize I'd been holding my breath. The lesson went a little smoother this time. James actually showed me how to shape the glass more precisely, and I watched his hands move with this quiet confidence that made me feel like I was staring at some kind of magic trick. The way he balanced the heat, the rotation, the timing, it was like he was dancing with the fire. Halfway through, he came up behind me to adjust my grip on the blowpipe. Our fingers brushed, just for a second, but it was enough to send a little shock through my arm. I caught his eye in the reflection of the furnace glass, and this weird, soft smile spread on his face. You're getting better, he said quietly. Thanks, I replied, though my voice caught a little. Feels like I'm getting burned more than anything. He nodded, eyes locked on the glowing orb at the end of my pipe. That's part of the process, You have to be willing to get a little scorched to make something beautiful. I turned to look at him, searching his face for something. Maybe reassurance, maybe just normal conversation. Instead, he said, I think you're the only one I've taught who didn't freak out handling the heat. Most people just want to step back the second the furnace door opens. I felt a mix of pride and embarrassment. Guess I'm used to dealing with heat in other ways, I said, half joking but hoping he'd pick up on the subtext. Instead, his smile deepened and he said, I like that about you. You don't run away when things get tough. Before I could respond, the class ended and the mood shifted. James wiped his hands on his apron and looked at me with a kind of intensity I hadn't expected. Hey, if you're not busy, there's a bar down the block. I've been wanting to check it out. Want to come? My mind scrambled for a cool response but settled on the simple truth. Yeah, I wanted to. Sure. Why not? The bar wasn't fancy, just a small dive with neon lights and mismatched stools. But it had character. We found a corner where the music wasn't too loud, and for the first time in a while, I felt relaxed just talking to someone. James told me about how he got into glassblowing, started as a way to escape a stressful corporate job, and I shared some stories about my own dead-end desk gig that made me want to crawl out of my skin. At some point, the conversation drifted to relationships, and I found myself admitting I haven't been on a proper date in, forever, maybe since college. James raised an eyebrow, giving me that look that felt like he was both amused and intrigued. Well, this could be the start of changing that. I laughed, a little nervous. Do you think you're up for dating a guy who can barely handle a blowtorch? He reached across the table and lightly tapped my hand. If you can handle the heat in that workshop, I think you can handle a date with me. It was cheesy, yeah, but it worked. I felt a flush creep up my neck, and when I looked at him, I saw that same warmth in his eyes I'd noticed in the studio. We talked for hours, the kind of easy back and forth where time just slips away. By the time we left, the air was cool and the street was quiet. James turned to me and said, almost like it was a confession, I'm glad you signed up for that class. I was hoping you would. I smiled, and without thinking, I said, me too. That night, lying in bed, I couldn't stop replaying everything. The heat, his smile, the way he watched me like I wasn't just fumbling with glass, but maybe, somehow, handling something bigger. I don't know where this is going yet, but for the first time in a long time, I wanted to find out. A few days later, I found myself scrolling through my phone, fingers hovering over James's number. Something about texting him felt different. Less casual than a simple hey, but not quite a full-on conversation yet. I settled on something safe. Hey, how's the heat treating you today? Sent. Then I immediately regretted it, half expecting no reply. But almost instantly, his answer popped up. Better now that you're thinking about it. That little ping made my chest tighten in an oddly good way. Over the next few days, our messages trickled back and forth, mostly about the workshop stuff. Tips on shaping the glass, when to cool it down, and occasional jokes about how I was probably going to set something on fire. But beneath it all was this growing thread of something more personal, like we were both testing the waters without really saying it out loud. When Thursday rolled around, I showed up at the studio with a little more confidence. James was already there, tinkering with some tools near the furnace. The moment he saw me, his face lit up. No pretenses, just genuine happiness. I felt my pulse quicken again. Ready to make something a little more interesting tonight? He asked, a mischievous grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. I'm game, I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. We spent the next 2 hours working side by side, the heat from the kiln warming the room and the silence between us. Not the awkward kind, but comfortable, the kind where you don't have to fill every second with words. Sometimes, he'd glance over and catch me mid-thought, and his eyes would soften, like he was seeing something inside me that I didn't always show. At one point, I accidentally dropped a small piece of hot glass onto the floor. I froze, expecting a scolding or even just a sigh. Instead, James just shook his head and laughed. You're too hard on yourself. Glassblowing isn't about perfection. It's about patience and a little bit of chaos. I looked up at him, and he was watching me like he was letting me in on some secret. Kinda like life, huh? Exactly, I said, surprised at how natural the words felt. When we finally took a break, James pulled 2 cold bottles of water out of a cooler behind the counter and handed one to me. You're doing better than most first-timers. Seriously. Thanks, I said, taking a long sip. I think I just want to impress you. He raised an eyebrow. Oh? Do you have a plan for that? I shrugged, suddenly feeling a bit embarrassed. Not really. I'm winging it. He smiled, that slow, genuine smile that somehow made me forget the heat in the room. Winging it works for me. After the class, we lingered by the furnace, the orange glow casting long shadows on our faces. I wasn't sure who spoke first, but the conversation turned more personal. James told me about his ex, a relationship that burned out because they both wanted different things. I shared some of my own past disappointments, the ghost of a long-ago breakup that still stung more than I expected. It felt strange and wonderful to be so open, like all the heat and fire around us was melting away the walls I'd built up. Then, out of nowhere, James reached over and lightly touched my arm. I'm glad you didn't back out after the first class, he said softly. Me too, I admitted. I wasn't sure I could handle the heat. He laughed, and it was like music in the still room. Looks like you can. For a moment, we just looked at each other, the air thick with something unspoken. Then, with a little nervousness, I asked, So, what happens now? James tilted his head, eyes sparkling. Now? We keep blowing glass. And maybe we see where this goes. That night, I left the studio feeling lighter than I had in months. The heat wasn't just in the glass anymore. It was inside me, sparking something new. I wasn't sure what we had or where it would lead, but for the first time, I was ready to find out, no matter how much heat came with it. Over the next few weeks, our glass-blowing sessions became less about the craft and more about the moments between. I found myself deliberately arriving early, pretending to need extra time to set up, just so I could catch James before anyone else showed up. He was always there, already tending to the furnace or arranging tools with that focused look that made my stomach do flips. One evening, after the class had officially ended and the last of the students filtered out, James and I stayed behind. The workshop was bathed in the warm, flickering light of the dying furnace, and the usual chatter was replaced by a comfortable quiet. I'm working on a new piece, James said, holding up a delicate glass flower that caught the light in the most beautiful way. Thought I'd try something a little more organic. I reached out, carefully tracing the smooth petals with a finger. It's amazing. You make this look effortless. He smiled, but there was a hint of vulnerability behind it. It's taken years to make it look effortless. Most days, I still feel like I'm barely keeping the glass from slipping away. I looked at him, suddenly wanting to say something real, something more than the usual safe small talk. I get that. Some days, I feel like I'm just trying not to let everything fall apart. He met my gaze, and for a moment, the world outside the studio faded. You're doing better than you think, he said quietly. The way he said it, like he really believed it, made my chest tighten. Thanks, I whispered. We stood there, the heat from the furnace warming us as the glow danced in James's eyes. Then, without thinking, I reached out and brushed a stray curl off his forehead. He didn't pull away. Instead, his hand found mine, fingers intertwining in a way that felt like the most natural thing in the world. Funny, he said softly. I never thought I'd meet someone who could handle both the glass and the crazy. I laughed, a bit breathless. Maybe we're both crazy. He squeezed my hand gently. Maybe, but I like crazy when it's with you. That night, as I walked home, the city lights blurred around me, but inside, everything felt sharper, more alive. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't just existing. I was feeling, hoping, wanting. Our next few classes were a dance of glances, touches, and stolen moments. James started showing up with coffee in the mornings, and I brought snacks, little things that had nothing to do with glass blowing, but everything to do with us. We shared stories about family, dreams, mistakes, and those stories wove us closer together. One evening, after a particularly tough session where I'd nearly botched a simple vase, James pulled me aside. Hey, he said, his voice low, don't be so hard on yourself. Even the best of us mess up. I know, I murmured, feeling the sting of failure. But it's frustrating. He leaned in, eyes searching mine. You know, sometimes the most beautiful pieces come from the cracks and imperfections. I blinked, surprised at how deeply that hit me. You really think so? He nodded. I know so. Then, tentatively, he reached up and brushed his lips to mine. It wasn't rushed or desperate, just a gentle, deliberate kiss that felt like a promise. My heart was pounding as I pulled back slightly, searching his face. Wow. He grinned, that mischievous smile that made me want to lean in again. Yeah, wow. From that moment on, things shifted between us. The glass blowing was still our shared passion, but it became the backdrop for something new, a connection that was fiery, fragile, and full of potential. One night, as we cleaned up the studio, James stopped and looked at me, his expression serious for once. I don't want this to be just a summer thing, he said. I want to see where this goes. I felt a rush of warmth flood through me. Me too, I admitted. We stood there, hands still linked, surrounded by the glowing embers of the furnace and the delicate pieces we'd created together. In that moment, I realized that sometimes you have to step into the heat. Not just the fire of molten glass, but the fire of vulnerability and chance. And maybe, just maybe, that's where the most beautiful things are made. After that night, things between James and me settled into this quiet rhythm that felt both thrilling and terrifying all at once. I kept wondering if I was dreaming or if this was real, because, honestly, I'd never been very good at letting someone in. But with James, it was different. The walls I'd built around myself weren't falling down all at once. They were easing open, like the glass we shaped together, fragile but strong. We started spending more time outside the studio, too. One Saturday, he invited me over to his place, which was this cozy loft filled with plants and his finished glass pieces displayed like trophies. I felt a weird mix of excitement and nerves, like I was about to meet the person behind the instructor, the man who watched me handle the heat like no one ever had. He poured us some wine, and we sat on the couch, talking about everything and nothing. He told me about growing up in a small town, about how glassblowing had saved him from a pretty miserable corporate grind. I shared stories about my own past, flings that never turned into anything, moments I regretted, times I wished I had been braver. At one point, I caught him watching me with that soft, almost hesitant look. You're different, he said quietly. Not in a bad way. I mean, you're not like anyone I've met before. I laughed, but it wasn't a joke. I'm not sure I know who I am yet. He reached over and took my hand. Maybe we can figure it out together. It felt like a promise, a lifeline. And for once, I wanted to grab it. As weeks slipped by, our connection deepened. Our glass pieces became more ambitious, vases with delicate twists, spheres with swirling colors. And every time I held one of those creations, I thought about James and how he'd helped me see that the heat wasn't something to fear. But life, as it always does, threw in a curveball. One evening, James seemed distant. After class, he cleaned his tools with a distracted air. His usual spark dimmed. I hesitated but finally asked, "Hey, everything okay?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Yeah, just stuff. Family stuff. It's been stressing me out." I nodded, not wanting to pry but wishing I could do something. "If you want to talk, I'm here." He gave me a small, grateful smile but didn't say more. Over the next few days, I kept checking in, sending little texts, but he stayed a bit withdrawn. It made me realize how much I'd come to rely on his presence, how much I wanted to be more than just the guy he taught glassblowing to. One night, I found myself standing outside the studio after hours, debating whether to knock or just leave. Before I could decide, the door creaked open and James appeared, looking surprised but relieved. "I couldn't sleep," he said, stepping aside to let me in. Inside, the studio was darker, the furnace cooled, but the air still carried the faint scent of molten glass. We sat on the floor, backs against the wall, and for a while, neither of us said anything. Then, softly, James opened up. His dad was sick, and he'd been feeling overwhelmed trying to juggle everything. "I didn't want to burden you," he admitted. I shook my head. "You're not a burden. We're in this together, remember?" He looked at me. the vulnerability in his eyes raw and honest. "Thanks for sticking around." I reached out, brushing a stray curl off his forehead again. "Always." That night, as we sat there in the quiet, I felt something shift, like we were no longer just two people sharing a hobby, but partners facing whatever came next. A few weeks later, we planned a weekend trip out of the city. Just us, some hiking trails, and a chance to escape the noise. I was nervous about the trip, about spending so much time alone with someone, but also excited. This relationship was new, fragile, and full of possibilities. On the trail, James was easygoing and funny, making me laugh even when the path got steep. At the summit, we sat in silence, taking in the vast view. Then he turned to me and said, "I'm glad you signed up for that glassblowing class." I smiled, feeling the warmth spread through me, not from the sun, but from him. "Me too." He reached out, taking my hand, fingers weaving into mine naturally. "Whatever happens next, I want to face it with you." And just like that, standing on top of the world, I realized that I wasn't scared anymore. The heat, the risk, the uncertainty, it was all part of the process. Like glassblowing, relationships take patience and a willingness to be vulnerable. But when you trust the fire, you can create something stronger than you ever thought possible. As we headed back down the trail, hand in hand, I knew this was just the beginning. Not just of us, but of me finally learning to handle the heat, and maybe even thrive in it. The days after that hike felt like we were floating somewhere between reality and a dream I wasn't sure I deserved. There was this new comfort between us, like we'd passed some invisible threshold, from tentative to something real. James and I still met at the studio, but now our hands found each other in the midst of shaping glass, a gentle squeeze here, a brush of fingers there. Those small touches carried weight, like they were promises waiting to be spoken aloud. One evening, after an especially long class where we'd both been experimenting with different shapes instead of just the usual beginner stuff, James suggested we grab dinner. The place was a little Italian joint down the street. Dim lights, cracked leather booths, and the kind of warm, slightly chaotic vibe that made me feel alive. We slid into a booth near the back, and for a while the conversation was easy and light. We talked about music, childhood memories, and James's endless obsession with old sci-fi movies. At some point, the topic shifted to the future, and I caught a flicker of something serious in his eyes. "What do you want?" he asked quietly. I blinked, caught off guard. "I mean, I want to keep learning glassblowing for one, and honestly, I want to see where this goes, with you." He smiled, but didn't say anything right away. Instead, he reached across the table and tucked a loose strand of hair behind my ear. "Me too. It's scary, letting someone in." "Yeah," I said, feeling the truth of that settle in my chest. "But it's also kind of necessary, if you want something real." He nodded, and just like that, the air between us thickened, not with awkwardness, but with anticipation. Dinner ended, but instead of heading home, we wandered the streets, the city buzzing around us in that late-night haze. We stopped outside a small park, the benches empty except for us. James turned to me, eyes reflecting the street lamp glow. "Can I be honest? Always." He took a breath, then said, "I've been hurt before. I'm scared it'll happen again." I reached out, fingers brushing his cheek. "I'm scared too, but you're not alone in that." He smiled softly, the kind of smile that makes you want to hold on to a moment forever. And then, without another word, he leaned in and kissed me. It was gentle but sure, like we were both testing the waters but ready to dive in head first. Afterward, we just stood there, hands entwined. I realized how much I'd wanted this. Someone who could see me, scars and all, and still want to be near. Back at the studio the next morning, things felt different. Our glances lingered longer. Our touches were more intentional. As I worked on a piece, James came up behind me and whispered, "You ever think about what you want to make? Beyond the glass?" I paused, considering. "I want something that lasts. Something beautiful, but real." He smiled. "Me too." One day, as the class wrapped up, James surprised me by pulling me aside. "I want to teach you something new," he said. eyes twinkling. He led me to a corner where the furnace blazed hotter than usual. "This is the annealer," he explained. "It cools the glass slowly to make it stronger. It's kind of like healing." I looked at him, suddenly understanding the metaphor. "You think we need that? Healing?" He shrugged, a little embarrassed. "Maybe. We all have cracks." That night, I lay awake thinking about cracks and healing, about the fire we'd faced and what it had done to us. I thought about how scary it was to open up, to let someone in after years of keeping everything locked tight. But I also thought about James's hand in mine, the way he looked at me when he thought I wasn't paying attention. A few days later, we celebrated the end of the workshop with a small gathering at the studio. Friends, art lovers, and a few regulars showed up, filling the space with laughter and music. James and I stood together, watching our glass creations sparkle under the soft lights. He squeezed my hand and said, "You've come a long way." I smiled, feeling something inside me settle. "So have you." Later, when the night quieted down, we found ourselves alone again. James pulled me close, whispering, "I'm glad you handled the heat. I want to keep seeing you do it." I laughed softly. "I think I'm getting the hang of it. With you." He kissed me then, slow and sure, like this was the start of something that might just last. As I walked home that night, the city felt alive with possibility. The heat wasn't just in the glass or in James's smile, it was in me. In the way I was beginning to trust, to hope, and maybe even to love. And honestly, that felt worth every scorch and every risk. Months passed, and with every glass piece we shaped, every late-night talk, every shared laugh and quiet moment, James and I built something stronger than just an art project. We were learning to trust each other, to handle the heat that life throws at you. Not perfectly, but together. One evening, after a long day at the studio, James surprised me by pulling out a small, wrapped box. My heart sped up as I unwrapped it to find a delicate glass pendant, swirls of amber and green, warm and alive in the light. "It's yours," he said softly. "Something to remind you that even when things feel fragile, they can still be beautiful and strong." I looked up, catching the sincerity in his eyes, and felt this wave of something I hadn't quite named before. Gratitude, definitely. Hope, maybe. But most of all, a quiet kind of love that felt steady and true. I slipped the pendant over my head, and it felt like more than just a piece of glass. It was a symbol of everything we'd been through. The awkward first class, the stolen glances, the fears we'd shared, and the way we kept choosing each other despite all of it. We sat together on the workbench, hands entwined, the soft glow of the furnace behind us, casting long shadows. I realized that this wasn't just about glass or heat, or even chance. It was about finding someone who sees you clearly, cracks and all, and still wants to be there. James caught my eye and smiled. "Ready to make something new? Together?" I nodded, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with the furnace. "Yeah, let's do it." In that moment, surrounded by molten glass and the quiet hum of the studio, I knew we were crafting more than art. We were carefully molding a future. Fragile, maybe, but worth every risk, because sometimes the most beautiful things come from the hottest fires, and the bravest hearts are the ones willing to handle the heat.